This is week number 10, and in this week we are going over out of flow positioning, a word that we have already touched on a little bit over the last weeks. However, we haven't gone into detail. Let me herefore take a Word document as an example. So here I have a little bit of text and an image underneath. And if I take this image and drag it wherever I want to, then this image will be displayed at this location. Whatever text came before still comes before, whatever text comes after comes afterwards. Things are considered to be in the flow. Where the content is, this is where it will be displayed. If I take it somewhere else, this is where the image will be displayed. The other text has to make space for that image and has to move further to the right and will be displayed afterwards. Now what we can do inside a Word document, we can take that image out of the flow by bringing it either behind or in front of the text. And whenever we do so and then move that image around, it will never disturb that other content anymore. That content here, that text, which is still in normal flow. Now this image is on a different layer. It's not in normal flow anymore. It's not distracting any other content. And that is, even though it's a little bit more detailed on the web, but in its essence, it's exactly the same what we are dealing with in this week. And before I get started now, let me do a more detailed review than I usually do, because it's been a while now since we have touched on real positioning. That was in week number 4 and 5, and then we went into history and then multimedia. So therefore, let me bring across once again the most important thing that we already went over in those weeks. So what I have created here for explaining those examples once again is I have 2 container boxes here, and container boxes, they are always display block. So container boxes can be created by div elements, which ones I have used, and those container boxes div elements, they are always neutral. Division stands for division, dividing our content up into its individual parts, the different container boxes. Now these are the container boxes here that have meaning. These ones here are also container boxes. And figure, for example, canvas, SVG is a container box. A container box is an element that can have many other things inside it, other elements, other container boxes, images, text. These are container boxes, and they are always display block by default, set by the browser's style sheet to display block. In comparison to all our text elements are always display inline. They shall never move away from the line. Here we can see line by line, text by text is displayed here in each line. And if we are wrapping a text element around a certain word or a couple of words inside this line, then we cannot give it a width or a height, because those elements shall never destroy the line of the text. The text shall always be on the same line. And therefore all these elements are display inline. They cannot have a width and a height. And everything that is not a text element nor a container box, those elements are display inline block. They are still inline, however they can still have a width and a height. For example, video, audio, embed, iframe, the image, all our server elements ultimately apart from the anchor. But all of them can still have a width. They need a width and a height, such as an image or a video. And nevertheless, they are not block, but they are inline. So let's take a look at the effects actually, what block and inline level elements have. So what I have here is these 2 container boxes. All I have given them is a background color of orange, nothing else. I haven't given them any dimensions, nor a width, neither a height. The other way, neither a width nor a height, and therefore they will be, what are the dimension rules for block level container boxes? They are as high as their content, meaning that text is right now the content that is inside this box. If I was about to remove this one, then that box would not have any height at all, as it has no content. And in regards to the width, it is block level container boxes are as wide as the parent. And the parent box in which those 2 orange boxes are inside goes until here, and therefore the orange boxes also go until here. And to be actually more precise, they go until the content area. They will completely take up the content area of their parent. For example, if this box had a little bit of padding here, a gap inside the box, then those two orange boxes would end right here as well. So that's the precise version. However, let me use now in the coming minutes, let me define it always as wide as the parent to keep it simple. So they are as wide as their parent and as high as their content, block level container boxes. And now I will be specifying a certain width for both of these container boxes. One I have given an ID repeat container 1, the other one repeat container 2, and I will now set the width to 40%. And whenever we are using a value that is not pixel, for example percent, then we are not telling the browser, hey, make it that wide. Instead, percentages are always relative. Relative always to the parent. And both of these boxes, their parent is this one, and that parent goes until here. And right now they are taking up 100% space of their parent. And now as I have set them to 40%, they will only take up 40% of the line in which they are inside. And nevertheless, block level elements, even though we have now defined a width that is smaller than the line itself, nevertheless, they still stretch all the way indirectly. They still occupy the remaining space on that line. And this ultimately is the result. This gives us that effect of having content block by block on top of each other. Because even though the width is smaller, they still take indirectly up the remaining space here, ultimately causing whatever comes afterwards having to move into the next line. And here again, next thing has to move into the next line, as this area here is still indirectly occupied by each of these elements. And because this area still indirectly belongs to that element, in this case this area here, therefore both of these elements can still make use of that area. And this is therefore why we can center those block level elements by using the value auto for margin left and margin right. Margin is the gap outside the box, and we are telling here with the value auto automatically, we are telling the browser, hey, whatever remaining space there is that this element still indirectly occupies, divide it up by 2, put 1/2 on the outside of the box on the right, and the other half shall be the gap outside of the box on the left. And making the elements here to vertically align by using the auto value for top and bottom does not work, because there is no area that this element or this element here occupies. It only indirectly occupies some area horizontally on that line. And therefore we can only make use of auto for right and left when we are setting it to the margin. And this is exactly what I will be doing now. What I have already given here is a margin on top and bottom to 10 pixel. I have set it, and now I will be using the right, and for the right and for the left I will be setting the value auto. And this will cause both of these boxes now to be centered. Half of that remaining space here on that line is given to the right, the other half to the left. And now I immediately turn that into 0 again, so to the original where we left off before. And instead what I will be changing now is the display value. By default, block level container boxes are display block, and now I'm changing it to this hybrid value inline block, meaning the elements still can have a width and a height. However, inline, this is exactly now what it means. They only take up now as much as their actual width. And that remaining space on that line is not indirectly given to these elements. Neither to this one. It's both of them are taking up 40%, and that's it. Nothing here is given to it, only until here. That area here is not, let me cross it out here, that is not given to that element. And therefore there is now space for the other element to move up into that line. And this one is 40 pixel, this one is 40 pixel, and a line has 100%, this is 40%, this is 40%, and a line has space for 100%, of course. and therefore there is enough space for that element to move here, and therefore it will move here up here. And if that element, for example, had a width of 80%, it would still only take up as much width as the actual width that we have assigned, but it would not have space here, so it would be on the second line still, but it would still be an inline level element. And because we have those two elements are now not occupying the remaining space of that line anymore, therefore we cannot make use of margin order on the left and on the right in order to center these elements. Inline level elements, however, what we can do here, the option that we have is to use text align, using the value center. All inline level elements and only inline level elements, not block elements, can make use of these properties, among which is text align, which I will now be setting, and text align is an inherited property, and inherited properties must always be applied on the parent. And the parent of this container box here, of both of them, is the container box with the ID outer flow container, and that is the one I will now be setting text align center on, causing both of these, all the inline content that is inside that container box, to be centered in the middle. So here we have the option for block level elements. We use margin order to center them on left and right, and for inline level elements we use text align center to center them. Vertically center them, block level elements, we haven't yet seen an option, which we are going over in this week. And inline level elements are barely centered, but if so, we can center them by using the line height, setting the line height to the exact same height as the parent, and then vertically align those elements to the middle. But for block level elements, we haven't yet seen an option, which we are discussing today. And for the exact same reason, to finish up now, for the exact same reason, because each of these elements are now in line, only taking up as much as their actual width and not the remaining space here anymore on that line. Therefore, the dimension rules have now changed as well. They are still as high as their content, this one doesn't change, but the width rule changed. They won't be as wide as their parent anymore, because they cannot stretch now all over the entire area here. Instead, they will have exactly the same rule as the height. So once I remove the width, they will be as wide as the content, as high as the content and as wide as the content. So this was a rather now more detailed repetition of what we have done, so we are on the same page, as this stuff is essential for us to understand and in order to follow in this week and also in the coming weeks. And now we are going into out of flow positioning. And hereby we are making use of the property in CSS, the position property. And the position property for all elements, the value that is being used here is static. All our elements are by default static, and all that means static is they are in the flow. Where they are displayed on our website, this is where they will be positioned. So let me go inside our HTML file. What I have created here is a container box, and that container box I have now inserted into before the image, inside the container box that has this black border. And because it's inserted before the image, that's why it will be displayed before the image. And here we have it. And the image had to move down. Things are in the flow. And this box is now as wide as its parent. It's relative to the parent. And it is as high as its content. It's a block container box, display block. And this container box is always, things are always in the flow in regards to the parent. So if I take this one out and insert it after the image, it will be inserted after the image, inside that container box, inside that parent. If I take this now out and insert that box as first child, for example, of the main info container, which is the one with the light blue background, and once I reload the page, then this is the first element being displayed in that box. Things are in the flow. Whatever came afterwards, such as this section, the headline here, etc., had to move down in order to make space now for that box, as this one is in the flow. It still takes up space inside here, causing all the other things that come afterwards to move further down. Things are in the flow. And whenever we are changing now that value away from static, which all elements are by default, then we are taking things, our elements, our content, out of the flow. And there are 3 more values that we can make use of. And we will be starting with the value fixed, which is most likely the easier one. And whenever, irrespective which value we are using, whenever it's not static, then and only then we can make use of these properties here, which we will be making use of in order to ultimately define the position of this element where we want that one that is now on a different layer, on out of the flow, on a different level. And we will be starting with fixed, that value which we already know from background attachment. We have used this value in order to make our background, in this case, attach it fixed to the viewport. And whenever we attach something fixed to the viewport, what is the viewport once again? The viewport once again is actually, let me scroll down a little bit so it becomes immediately clear, is that rectangle that is displayed to us, that is given to us, where we can see the content at the given point in time without scrolling the page. So whatever is further up on top or further down doesn't right now belong to the viewport. If I scroll further down now the viewport is still this area. It's the area that is right now at the given point in time visible to us. So it's this rectangle here in which the website is displayed without scrolling the page. And we have given our background here, we have made it fixed to that viewport, to that area. And whenever we are scrolling, therefore it's fixed to the viewport, it will always scroll along. It will always be there, our background image. And this is exactly what that value position fixed will do to our element. We take it out of the flow, and whenever we are using a dimension, a width or a height in percentages, because percentages are always relative to the parent. But once we are taking an element out of the flow, it does not have a parent really anymore. Or not really, as we will see in a moment. And therefore, when we make use of percentages, it will be relative to the viewport. And when we make use of these properties, top of what? Top of the viewport, right of the viewport, bottom left of the viewport. So let me now take this element out of the flow, which I have given an ID of go to top container. And this one I am now targeting, and I'm changing the value for position away from static, which all elements are. I am now giving it the value fixed. And I have inserted that container box as first child of the blue box. And this is where it is still being displayed now. So it starts out at that location where we have inserted that code. However, once we are now making use of relative values such as percentages or top right, bottom left, it will always be relative to the viewport. So first of all, here this box now has no parent anymore and doesn't go all the way. It doesn't take up the width of the parent. It will have now, even though it's a block level container box, which would go as wide as the parent. I haven't specified any dimensions yet. It would be as wide as the parent, but it's now only as wide as the content, and the height rule never changes. It is as high as its content. And it's taken out of the flow, it's on a different layer, meaning everything that came afterwards here took its spot. It's now available, this spot. It's not occupied here anymore. It's on a different layer. Everything else moved up here that came afterwards. And now we are making use of those values top. So top, let me give it 20 pixel, let me give it on the left, let me give it 20 pixel. And the question here becomes top of what, left of what, 20 pixel where from, and from the viewport. So it's now displayed, this box, 20 pixel from the viewport, away from the top and also away from the left. So all these values that we are assigning in pixels, in either here for top, left, bottom and right, are always in regards to the viewport. And when we use a width of 100%, it will stretch 100% of the viewport. So the percentages are then in regards always. Everything is relative to the viewport. In addition, it's fixed to the viewport, meaning when we are scrolling along now further down the page, this box is always there. It's fixed to the viewport. Not only is it relative, but also fixed to the viewport. And now what we want to achieve, something that makes sense. For example, on this website, something that we can see quite on numerous websites. For example, there is a button, or it's just a container box that acts as a button. And once we click it, we end up on the top of the page again. Once we click this one, then the menu appears. And this is exactly those two buttons we now want to fake or want to create on our website as well. Therefore, first of all, let me remove that content, that little bit of text that is inside this box, meaning now the box is gone as it does not have any content by which the width and height is right now being determined. Instead, I will give it now a width of 40 pixel and a height of 40 pixel. And here is our box. Right now I have positioned it away from the left and from the top. Now I will instead use bottom, move it away from the bottom of 100 pixels and move it away from the right 10 pixels. So I'm now using the other two values that we haven't yet used. Bottom, I want it 100 pixels away, and from the right I will go for 10 pixels. And this is where now our box is being displayed. Let's immediately go for our next box. And actually, before we do so, this box now, actually the code we have inserted right here as a child of the blue box, the light blue box. However, this one is now been taken out of the flow, so it's not a child of that box anymore. And whenever we take something out of the flow, where would we actually insert that code? It's a common way to do it is either at the end, before the body closes, so at the end of our code, or at the beginning, and I will now go for the beginning here. As things are not relative to another element, they are relative to the viewport. And here is my second element, which I have given an ID display menu container, and now this exactly shall just be now the other box, which shall also be 40 pixel in width and height, shall be taken out of the flow, fixed, relative and fixed to the viewport. And in this case, however, I wanted to move away from the top 100 pixel, right is still fine, and this is where it will be displayed. As a brief repetition, let me just insert here an image, so to give us another option how to center something, which I haven't discussed in the opening when I did the repetition on on centering things. So what we can also do, of course, we can use padding. If I would now, I'm now including here an image, and first of all let me give it a source, and the source I'm using, it's inside the media folder, inside images, and then it's go to top, and that is a PNG image, and this one I will be giving a width now of 25 pixel, and that is a square image, meaning its height is now also 25 pixel. And because this box has a width of 40 and a height of 40, that means that there is horizontally still 15 pixel left for that image, which it doesn't occupy. Same for vertical. So I will now divide that 15 pixel up by 2, which is 7.5 pixel, and put a padding, which is a gap inside the box, 7.5 pixel on each side, which causes that image to be centered as well. So here another option that we have. So padding, let me set it to 7.5 pixel, and here right in the center will now that image be displayed. Now we are going into another container box that we want to be placed at the bottom of our viewport. And therefore I have not put those two other boxes right at the bottom, just for the reason so it doesn't disturb the example that we are going over now. And that example is, let me just get this bar here, something like this. This bar here is fixed to the viewport. Wherever we are scrolling, it's always visible ultimately. And that is what we now want to create. And therefore, the element I have already written the code for here, which I have given an ID of bottom container. And that bottom container is right here in CSS. I haven't given it any specifications yet, any CSS rules yet. And what I will give it, first of all, let me take it out of the flow by using position fixed. I want to have that element relative and fixed to the viewport. And now I can move it around by using bottom, and I will set it to 0. So it shall be at the bottom of the viewport. And it shall have a height of 60 pixel, for example. And it shall have a width, now let's do the other example, of 100%, so 100% of the viewport. And of course I first need to give it a background color in order that we can see it. First of all, let me give it gray. And this is where our box is now being displayed at the bottom of the viewport. and it will take up 100%. 100% of what? 100%. Usually it's 100% of the parent. However, once we have taken things out of the flow with fixed, it's relative to the viewport, meaning it's 100% of the viewport. Another option that we have here is, instead of using width, let me outcomment this one. So right now it doesn't have any width, it doesn't have any content, so there is no width. Therefore we can't see that box right now. And instead what we can also do, we can tell the browser, hey, make that box at left 0. 0 of course always referring to pixel. Or whatever it is. 0 is always 0. Percent can be anything. 0 is 0. Therefore we don't need any unit afterwards. So I'm now telling the browser, hey, I want this bottom box to be at left 0, meaning right here, left of the viewport. And now at the same time, I'm now using also the right value, and I'm telling the browser, sounds like confusing to the browser, hey, I want that box to also be at right at 0. And that is exactly how we can indirectly assign the width to an element as well. It shall be at left 0 and at right 0, which causes the browser to stretch this box all over. It will ultimately indirectly give us now that width of that box. So when to use which option sometimes depends, sometimes we can use both. So we will encounter a couple of examples in a moment. Let me do one example here with the height. So what we can also do once we can determine the height by using bottom and top together, so meaning both vertical values in this case. Let me also set it to 0 and let me remove the height of 60, which causes the element to start at 0 top and also be there at 0 bottom, ultimately making the browser to take up that height of that box. Now which way should we go for? Actually we already have an example here. Here we should go for a height, because it doesn't make any sense to use it otherwise, as we will see. If I, for example, use top now, how far from the top do I need to go down in order to make that box to end approximately right here? So I could go, for example, for maybe 500 pixel, which would approximately give us that result. However, the point of course here is that we never know the height of the viewport. Of course, that one always depends on the person that is visiting our website, how wide the browser window is. And usually the browser window is open full screen. However, then it of course depends whether that person is using a mobile phone, which has a very small screen, or whether that person is using a TV screen, which is a very large screen. So therefore our box will ultimately disappear. It will be 80% away from the 500 pixels away from the viewport. And that is still the fact. However, the viewport is less than 500 pixels, and therefore that box is not visible right now anymore. So an alternative that we could go here, we could go for percentages. Percentages meaning always the viewport in percent. So for example 85, which is that height. However, ultimately we want content in here. And that content most likely takes up most of that space here, and that space, this height shall never decrease. And this is exactly what percentage value do. Because now 85% is not from the top, so meaning that area here is 15%. However, those 15% always have a different height, because the viewport is smaller, 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 and here that box is only very tiny anymore. Still it's 15%, so or 85% from the top, meaning that one is 15% in height, but it changes of course. So in this example, we would go for a height and would not let the browser determine the height by bottom and top, so indirectly assigning the height here. Because those 60 pixels will always be 60 pixels. Wherever we are going with our browser window, it will always be at the bottom of the viewport, and it will always have a height of 60 pixels ultimately. Whatever we are ultimately inserting into our footer box. Now that one, once again, inside here, this box, even though this one is taken out of the flow, so the content that we have right here, everything is in the flow. Where things are, this is where they are displayed. And this box we have taken out of the flow by using position fixed now. Whatever we start to insert here is in normal flow again. However, in the normal flow of this box that has been taken out of the flow. Nevertheless, whatever we ultimately insert here is then in its normal flow in regards to the box. that has been taken out of the flow. So we could create boxes in here again by using display inline block, display block to put boxes on top of each other. So we are going forward here as regular once again, then inside the box. So this box has its own normal flow. The normal flow on our website here is still here, and this is the normal flow on a different layer then. That box, as this box has been taken out of the flow. Another example that I have already written the code for, where we can see that things are still in the flow, but the main reason why I have already created this code here is to give us an example of an alternative menu option, navigation option. Because navigations will be a major topic for us in regards to placing things out of the flow. These drop-down menus that are right here, they are always on top of other stuff. They are out of the flow. And an alternative menu that we can use is something like this. And this one, I have given a box. I have created a box here, which I have given a background color of black with a little bit opacity. And that one I have set to position fixed. And then I have moved it to the right of the viewport. Right here, right 0. And then from the top a little bit away. From the top something like 40%. And therefore it will always be at the viewport. And inside this box things are in normal flow as we have just discussed. So here is what I have created here is a block level element, another block level element, another one, and inside here are two other boxes that are inline block. So this is one element next to the other element, so they are next to each other, display inline block, and of course immediately I vertically aligned them to the top and also ultimately positioned them in the center by line height, using the line height in regards to the text, same line height as the height. And this is just another example for a menu that we can use, that we can also create another option that we have. And also I am now going over this example because we are now introducing a new value for our display property. So far the values that we have gone over in this course are inline, inline block and block. And now comes the value none. So of course ultimately only the left part shall be visible, meaning that part. That right part here shall not be visible. Unless a person clicks with the mouse on that button here, then this part shall become visible. But right now it shall not be visible. So what we can do, we can tell the browser, hey, don't display that part. Display none. And that is now our fourth value for the display property. So the element that we are now targeting, which name I have given doesn't really matter in this case. The point here is that we can set things to display none. So I will now be targeting nav text container, which is that right part here. And I have now set it to display none. This one is now not being displayed. And once a person clicks with the mouse here, then it will be displayed. I have already written the JavaScript for this feature. However, it can only be achieved by using JavaScript. So it's an event that happens. As we may still remember from week number 1, this is what we do in JavaScript so often. When something happens, an event, a mouse clicks somewhere, then JavaScript can change the content and the appearance of the content. It can change the HTML and the CSS. So in this respect, it's changing the CSS. Once this button gets clicked, the value display is changed from display none to display block. And then once the button is clicked again, then it's changed from display block to display none again. So this is our fourth value for the display property that we will encounter now in a couple of other examples as well. One difference between display none, first of all, and visibility, which we have already discussed as well, or opacity 0. Opacity is transparency. And when we set the transparency, the opacity to 0, it's completely transparent. And that is the same as visibility hidden. There are minor differences which we have touched on. However, both of these options ultimately do not remove that content. They just make it invisible, nothing else. It would still be here then ultimately the other part of the box. But it would just be invisible. It would still take up space on our website. in comparison to display none, which does not do so. It takes that element completely away. Still, we can get it back, of course, but it's not taking up space on our website. It's not there. It's not only invisible. It's gone. It's gone. Display none. So now comes our next example, and that one is in regards to right here a so-called overlay. An overlay is something that's that's appearing on top of the other stuff, most likely for the purpose of registering or a pop-up, something like this. And an overlay, so-called overlay, usually at least consists usually of two boxes. One box that has a background of black with a little bit of opacity, so the background still shines through the black a little bit. And then there is usually a box that is right in the center. And that box we need to horizontally and vertically align here inside the other box. So this is now where we are going over that option, our first time that we are seeing, at least in this course, that we are seeing that effect, how we can vertically align a block level element. Margin auto we can use for left and right, for horizontally centering it. But how to do it vertically, we will now take a look at. So this is a so-called overlay, and that overlay I have already created inside our HTML code. I have now here a container box with the ID overlay container, and inside that container box is another container box, which I have given the ID overlay inner container. So this one is a child of that one. The parent, this one here, will be the one with the black background and transparency, and this will be the box that shall be centered in the middle of that black box. Now in CSS, let me go to the overlay right here, and let me give that overlay, that black box, let me first of all take it out of the flow as it is positioned on top of the other things. And it will be positioned fixed, so wherever we are scrolling it shall always be there. So position fixed once again. I am taking it now out of the flow, and I want it to take up, it's now relative to the viewport, and I want this box to take up the entire area of the viewport. So I could go for width and height 100%, but for repetition, let's do it once again. I can also go for the alternative option, top and bottom 0, which ultimately causes the height to be 100%, and I can go for right and left 0, which ultimately is the same as width 100%. So both options we ultimately have here. Most likely here we would go for width and height 100%, as this would only require us to have 2 lines of code instead of 4 lines, but it's completely giving us ultimately the same result. And of course I need to give it a background color in order that we can see it, and I will give it a background color of black, and that one shall have an opacity, a little bit transparency. So an option that we have here, we can make use of that property opacity. And here comes now a so-called alpha value, a value that is in between 0 and 1. 0 meaning fully transparent, 1 meaning no transparency, no opacity. And I will go for 0.8, the O we not necessarily need to include here, and this is now our box. Taking up the entire viewport. But is it taking up the entire viewport? As we can see here, isn't it going only until here? And it is not. It is going until here. However, this box here, the bottom box that we have created before, that one we have taken out of the flow. Now our overlay we have taken out of the flow, and our site navigation is out of the flow as well. So are our 2 buttons here. Now who decides, or what is the rule here that ultimately determines what shall be further in the foreground and further in the background? And this is, if we don't specify anything else, will be decided upon where the code is. What's coming first will be then further in the background. The last one will be in the most foreground. And because the bottom container, this one here, is after the code comes after the overlay container, the black box we just created, therefore the bottom container will be further on top. And therefore also the site navigation as well. And here we have control, and let's introduce now our last property that all the elements can make use of, that are not positioned static, that are not in normal flow. They can make use of those, among which is also the Z or Z index. And with that property we ultimately determine that what shall be further in the foreground or in the background. And now in this case the overlay shall be on the most foreground. So therefore all we need to do here is specify it in a number which is 0 by default. For example 1, now the higher number will prevail, the one element with the highest number will be in the most foreground in case they are overlapping. Then of course we need to make use of it. Before it doesn't matter, but when they are overlapping, as it is happening in this situation. A common way to do it is going into 100 steps, but this one is not a must. It's just, for example, the font weight, if we can recall, can also be defined in 100, 200, 100 being the thinnest for the font, or 900 being the thickest. So it's a common way to do it, but it's not a must. Completely optional, up to us. Just a common way to do this thing. Now let's create the box inside this overlay container. So I will give now that box a width of 700 pixels and I will give it a fixed height of 350 pixels. And I will give it a background color so we can actually see it of green. And now let's take a look what happens. And this effect we have already seen in another week previous to this one. That now the child, this green box is a child of, so its parent is the black box. And whenever on a parent we are setting an opacity, all its children, may it be the direct children or the grandchildren, any descendants ultimately, will also be given that opacity. And this one is not inheritance. Instead, what happens here actually, the browser treats now the entire thing as one. And meaning, because it treats it as one, everything has ultimately, because if this box has an opacity, then everything else has it too. It treats it as one. It's not inheritance because we cannot reset it. So if I was about now to do opacity 1 here, wouldn't work. It wouldn't reset now, make this green box non-transparent. Doesn't work. It's not inheritance. And this makes sense if we take a look at position as well. It's exactly that same effect. As I have mentioned, if we, for example, create other boxes inside our bottom container box here, and they are in normal flow again, but it's not referring to the normal flow on our website, but it's a new normal flow. The normal flow inside this element, the bottom box here, the gray one, which we have taken out of the flow. This one has now its own normal flow. And these normal flow elements that are position static now in here, then once again, they are still always, they will always be fixed to the viewport. Same as our site navigation, all these things will always be fixed to the viewport, even though they are position static. But because the parent is position fixed, they will immediately also be in here. They won't now turn back into the normal flow of all the other content. They will be in their own normal flow. And they will be position static. Its parent, however, is position fixed, and therefore they are always scrolling along as well here. They will always be there. So it is exactly the same behavior that is going on here with position fixed. So if I would now reset a child, for example, these icons here, I would now reset to position static, but they are already position static. But the point here is it treats the entire element kind of as one. It's exactly the same that happens with opacity. And it is also the same that happens with display. If I now go for display none, so I'm now setting display none for the black container box. So that means everything is gone, including its children. If I would now reset on the child, the green box, I would now say, hey, display block. This one would not work. Because if we set something to display none, a parent, the entire children will also be not being displayed. And we can never get them back. Another example, these are 3 examples here that we have, and I believe are the only 3 examples, where no inheritance is going on, but makes sense. It treats them all as one, as otherwise that logic behind would not work out. It treats them as one. We cannot reset it ultimately. Now the question, however, becomes, so how do we get that box transparent and now non-transparent, this green box here? And something that we have already gone over. So instead of using opacity, which is referring to the element itself, we can set the opacity in the background. And the background is never affecting whatever is in the foreground. Background is same, it's on a different layer. And the background, here we can define the color at the same time with the opacity by using red, green, blue and alpha, that function. And here we can define the color black by using 0, 0, 0 and then define the opacity, which I will now set here to 0.8, causing now only the background of this element, black element, to have this opacity. The green box will not be receiving now that opacity. So this is the result, and now we will be centering this box in the middle. So we can use margin 0 auto, as we know, but we can only use it on the left and on the right side, so we couldn't use it on top and bottom, or at least we could use it, but it would not have any effect for the reason that we have discussed. So now comes the option how to vertically align and horizontally align our element with a different option by using now top 50% and left 50%. First of all, before I'm going over what I'm actually doing here, let me now reload the page and take a look what happens. Of course, what I'm doing here, I'm moving the box 50% in regards to the viewport from the left, and in regards from the top 50% down of the viewport relative to the viewport. However, this one did not get applied because this box is position static. Its parent is position fixed. Therefore, this one will always scroll along as well. However, its position is still static. And once the position is static, we cannot make use of top, left, right, bottom and Z index. So I will now set it to position fixed as well, which doesn't change anything in this case. It will still be fixed to the viewport. Later we would actually use another value here, as we will come across in a moment. However, now I will use fixed, and now it has been moved, this box, 50% away from the top of the viewport and 50% away from the left of the viewport. Meaning this point here, the top left corner, is right in the center of our viewport. And what we of course want is, we want the center of the box to be right here, and that would ultimately cause that box to be right centered in the middle. What we need to do is, we need to move that box further to the top, of course, and further to the left. By how much? By half the height and by half the width. And if we do so, we ultimately have that box centered. So the question is, how do we do it? And we can use it by a property that we already know, by using margin. So if I would now go for a margin on the left of 200 pixel, for example, this box would even move further to the left, to the right here, further away here from the center, actually 200 pixel. If I use now negative margins, with a negative, it goes in this way. And this is exactly what we want. And how much do we want that negative margin to go in this direction? Half the width. And how much negative to the top? Half the height of that box. And that will cause our box to be centered ultimately. So I will now go for margin top and half the height, which is 175 pixel, negative 175 pixel. And I will go for margin on the left of negative half 700, half the width, 350 pixel, negative 350 pixel. And now our box is right in the center. Now we have our option. Our first option, that's how to center a block level element vertically. At the same time, horizontally, it's now our second option, how to center it horizontally as well. Now comes a quicker option, and here we are introducing a new value, a value that we can use whenever we are dealing with pixel percent, or whenever we are dealing with dimensions, or at least in most of the circumstances. And that value is a function. So isn't it easier, or wouldn't it be easier, and which is also possible, to just tell the browser, hey, move it away from the top 50% and then immediately negative, or 50% but minus 175 pixel. And that is exactly possible by using the calc function, calculation function. So there is a block of code inside the browser that we can call. His name is calc. and we can call it, hey, you block of code, you are that function, you provide that functionality of calculating us something, and we are giving you that stuff, what we want you to calculate inside the brackets here. So we want you to calculate, we want you to calculate this, and then ultimately from the top this element will be 50% minus 175 pixel. And now let me just copy and paste this one down here, and let me outcomment those ones. So both options we have. Most likely this is the nicer option, as we don't need as much code, 2 lines of code instead of 4 lines, and here it is 350 pixel. And here same result. Let me now remove the white space here, and let's take a look what happens. Doesn't work anymore. Very important, white space must always be there. Always one white space in between here, between the symbol that we are using ultimately. And we can use plus, of course, we can use division, we can use multiplier, division, all that ones we can use, and we will be using the calculation function for numerous of times in the coming weeks. So there we will come across a couple of other operators, so-called operators here, that we will be making use of, mathematical operators. So this is our overlay. Now let's get back to original here, and I will now set display none, because this overlay shall only become visible, of course, when something happens. When, for example, a person clicks somewhere, then this overlay shall show up. And if we are building a user-unfriendly website, then, for example, a pop-up would show up after 10 seconds. So over time, we can also do it. We can also make something show up, an overlay show up over time. However, always we need JavaScript. Therefore, on click an event, on click or over time, that something shall be changed, content or the appearance of the content can only be done by using JavaScript. And now we are going into the other values that we have besides fixed, because often, of course, it is the case that we want an element to be out of the flow, but we do not want it fixed, nor do we want it to be relative to the viewport. For example, let me once again make use of this website here. Here is a video playing, and a video, something like a background video, does not exist. So video is part of our content created by the video element. And in order to play something on top of other content on top of other, we need to take it out of the flow. However, this content that is on top of that image that has been taken out of the flow, this one is not scrolling along. It's neither is it fixed nor is it relative to the viewport. And this is exactly now where we are coming to our other two values that we can give to the position property. And that is absolute and relative. And therefore I have created here a box once again at the same location where we started out, and that is right at the first position inside the box that has this border, right before the image comes out here. And now things are right now in normal flow, meaning the image has to move down, it has to make space for that box, which is as high as its content and as wide as its parent, block level container box. And the image now cannot occupy that space as it is taken. Things are displayed where they are, where the code is inside its parent. This is where things ultimately show up on our website. And the image therefore had to move down. And now I take this box, which I have given a class name of image bottom container, and I will now take it out of the flow. Image bottom container right here, and I will now change the position value from static to, let me once again go for fixed first. So fixed, even though it's relative to the viewport, nevertheless it still starts out here, that box. Wherever we have inserted our element, when we have taken it out of the flow, it still starts out at that location where we have inserted that code inside our HTML file. So it's right here, a child of that box with the black border. Therefore it's right now being displayed here. However, it's already fixed to the viewport, meaning it is moving along as we scroll the page, and it is also relative to the viewport as soon as we are making use of top, right, bottom, left, or width and height using percentages. Then it will all be relative to the viewport. It's fixed and relative to the viewport, even though it starts out at this location. So fixed, first of all, it's not its parent anymore, this one, even though it's still here, and therefore it's not having the width completely as the parent is. It's as wide and as high as the content. And now I'm changing this value to absolute. And let's take a look what happens. First of all, I have just reloaded the page, nothing happened. It's still right here, this is okay, this is where it just starts out, where we have inserted that code. And it's taken out of the flow, meaning same as with fixed, the image moved up as this box here is not taking up space on our website anymore, it's on a different layer. And it's as wide and as high as its content. And therefore, because it's on a different layer, this one is not its parent, therefore it's not as wide as its parent, it's not going until here. Now, the question becomes, first of all, it's not fixed to the viewport, so that's the first difference. Once I'm now scrolling the page, it doesn't follow us. It's not fixed to the viewport. The question now becomes, where is it relative to, as soon as we are making use of top, right, bottom, left, and also of dimensions when we are using dimensions with percentages. So let's find out. Let us do exactly the same example, first of all, again, that we have also used with fixed at the very beginning. Top 20 pixel and left 20 pixel. And let's take a look where this element will be. And again, it is relative to the viewport once we are defining dimensions. So 20 pixel away from the top, 20 pixel away from the left of the viewport. So therefore the only difference is that this option of setting position absolute, that things are not following along. It's not fixed to the viewport, however it's still relative to the viewport. But now comes the most important feature of that one. Because what does absolute actually mean? Something like absolutely means completely as well. Maybe also generally completely. Meaning it can be relative to the viewport, but does not must be, it does not have to be relative to the viewport. It's right now only relative to the viewport because all its parents, so that's our box we are dealing with, that parent, grandparent, all its ancestors are in normal flow, meaning as they are by default, they are position static. However, as soon as we are setting one of its parents to a position value other than static, meaning if we take one of its parents out of the flow, then this, our element that we are dealing with, our box here, will be relative, not to the viewport anymore. Instead, it will be relative to the next parent that is not in normal flow. And this is exactly what we are doing now. We are taking the parent now of this box out of the flow. Therefore, this box, our box we are dealing with, is now relative to that box. But now comes the question, if we take now this box out of the flow, then it's this one that is relative to the viewport, and therefore this one is also relative to the viewport because this one is. And therefore we have a third value that we are now introducing. So I'm now targeting the parent of our box that we are dealing with, and that parent I have given a class name of image container. And that one I will now take out of the flow. However, of course, if I use fixed, nothing will change. And first of all, now our entire box, the one with the border here, will be fixed and will be fixed to the viewport here, will always be there. This is not what we want. All we want now is that our box is relative to the parent and not to the viewport. And therefore here comes our third and last value that we can use, and that is exactly what it means, relative. Now it will not change anything. First of all, let me reload the page. It's all fine. The only difference now is that our box that we are dealing with here, that we have given a position of absolute, is now not relative to the viewport anymore. Instead, it's relative to the next parent that is out of flow, which is this one. And relative also, that value also takes things out of the flow. However, it doesn't really change anything. Let me therefore outcomment this and let us change our normal box, the one that we are dealing with here. Let us use position relative on this one. So what will happen here? Position relative doesn't change anything. We can still already now, it's out of the flow, as we can see here, it's on top of the image. And we can make use now of top, left, bottom, right, and Z index. However, the position that it would occupy if it was in normal flow, that position here, that area, is still reserved for that element. And therefore the image here, as we can see, cannot move up. So therefore that position relative does not really change anything. And this is exactly therefore the value that we always use to just provide a destination, an anchor for a absolute positioned element, in order for that one not to be relative to the viewport, but instead to be relative to whatever element we give position relative. And relative, as we can see here, the width relative, it's still as wide as the parent, and the width, it's relative. And we give this absolutely positioned element now a relative element to which it can be relative to. And therefore absolute, as the name implies, absolutely, completely, can generally be at any other element. Instead of fixed, which is always the viewport, absolute can be multiple. Whatever parent is, now it shall be relative to whichever parent we are giving position relative. So I hope it comes across. However, we are going over a couple of examples now to deepen what we have just discussed here. First of all, let us get now this absolutely positioned element box here down to the bottom, the example that I wanted to use in the first place, title box for bottom of image, as I have named it. And therefore I will be using bottom 0, and now we can set the width either 100%. Now that width is 100%, not of the viewport, but of the next parent that's position relative. And here we go, now it's 100% of the parent, because that one we have made to position relative. And here that box is now at the bottom of this box here with the black border. Let us go into an example now that we will not code out. Back to this one here, there is a video playing. How would we achieve something like this? Put something on top of that video. First of all, what we would create is a box. A box in which that video also will be inside. And that box we would not set to position fixed, because here we have a scroll bar things. That video shall not move along. So we would use absolute ultimately for stuff. Or relative, one of those options. And relative we only make use of when we want an absolute element to be relative to that element that is then relative. So here is a box. Let me first of all mark the boxes. And let me change the color here to green, for example. So what we are dealing with here is this outer box has 3 other boxes inside, which I am now marking in green. It has this second box here, and now comes the third box. And these 3 boxes that are inside here, that I have marked in green, they must be on top of the video. And therefore they must be out of the flow in order to be on top of other content. And we would use position absolute. And that would mean it would be relative to the viewport. Unless we set the box, the outer box, that one right here, which takes up the entire area here. That one we set to position relative. And then when we make use of position absolute for this, and for this, and not this one, and for this box, then this one will always be relative to the outer box. And how would we go about this one? Easy, as we have discussed. So this one would just be top 0. It would start out at 0. The width we would determine either by width 100% or left and right to 0. And then we give it a height, a certain height. Now our bottom container, same thing here, we would send it to the bottom. Bottom 0 would give it a certain height, and then width 100% or left, right 0, one of those options. Now this one is a little bit more trickier, but something that we have just discussed as well. What we would do, we would center it vertically by the option that we have introduced by using top 50%. We can use the calculation function, 50% of the height of this entire box. So half of that box, that's the entire box, and half of that 50% we would move it down and then use half of that value also in order to ultimately center this box here. and then here we give it a certain height, half of the certain height by which we take the half of the height from. So nothing complicated. But let's get a little bit more used to relative and absolute. So fixed, first of all, fixed we would only use when we really want it to be fixed to the viewport, meaning we want something to scroll along, to always be there whenever we are scrolling. That is when we would use fixed. Relative, we would only, at least I don't have any other example, we would only use position relative in order to serve as a destination, a relativity, a relative point for an absolute box, for an absolute element that we set to absolute. So fixed only for when we scroll, relative only for serving as a relativity point for absolute elements. So let's do another example, and that is in regards to an option again that we have in order to create our navigation. Now this is kind of the traditional navigation here, whether it's horizontal or vertical doesn't matter. Another option that we have is, and what I have already created the code for, but by which we discuss relative and absolute once again, is this one I have created. So what I have here, what we are dealing with here is, first of all, a container box that takes up the entire area here. And then inside here are two other container boxes that are children of that green box. This box, number 1, which I have given a gray background, and this one, number 2, which is a tiny one, that one I have given a black background here. And this black box has another child, another box, this one. So let me call it 2b in this case. And exactly this is the one that we want to be dealing with in terms of relative and absolute. So the ultimate effect that we want to achieve is this one. Table of contents, and here is the content table. So something like this. And therefore, first of all, let me take this entire box here out of the flow. As right now it's in the flow, causing our header element, which comes afterwards, to move down. It cannot move, take this spot, is occupied, as this entire box here is in normal flow. So the entire area here, which I have given top nav container, which is the entire area, I will now give a position of fixed first of all. Because it shall, for example, always be there whenever we scroll along. So here we go, now it's fixed. And now for the other values, I will be using now for the top nav main container, that one I have given a height of 300 pixels. And the bottom box, this is the gray one, and the bottom one, which I have given a black background, that one I have given a height of 20 pixels. And first of all, I will be giving some dimensions now. Because right now it takes up the dimensions because of that green box has some content in here, and actually that one I have given a certain width already. So a width of 150 pixels, that is exactly the width that all of that stuff is now taking up. So the gray area, first of all, shall take a width of 100% of its parent, actually, and now let me set it right here. Now this one, which results in this one, our actual result. However, this area we don't want to be displayed, the gray area. So let me immediately remove that one by using display none, because that area is also not the one that we are now taking a look at. The important stuff is, how do we get this green button, same as on this website. So this is our green button in this case. How do we get it to this location, that it is always there and never somewhere else? So we need to take it, of course, out of the flow. But which value are we using? And we are using fixed when it shall be fixed, but fixed in this case, it's not the option, as this one, it shall be fixed, of course, ultimately, but it is already fixed. It's absolute. Let's go for absolute, which is the top nav bottom container. This one I will give now, which is the opener. I will now give a position of absolute. And let's take a look what happens. Nothing yet happens, as it will always start out at the location where it is. But as soon as we are now making use of left, so let me move it away from the left 70%, and let me move it away from the top 20 pixel, which is exactly the height of its parent. So it should be somewhere here. And this is where it is. Now let's take a look what happens when I open this box, which I have already written the JavaScript for. So this one is now relative. I have used absolute, but right now none of its parents is positioned. Now its parent is actually fixed, but that parent already takes up the entire area here, which is fixed. It's relative to the viewport. And this one shall not be relative to the viewport. This one shall be relative to the black box. It shall always stick to the blue box here. And therefore I am now setting position relative on the black box, and then everything is fine. So here that black box the only purpose that it has, it serves as relativity point for the which I have now given to the wrong one bottom container, the black one. And now this one only serves as relativity point for our green button there that opens ultimately that navigation. That's the only reason, at least what I have examples for, that why we would make use of relative. That absolute has a relativity point other than the viewport itself. And here everything is fine. Now it's right there. Now one last example that we will go over, where we also now take a look at negative values, which we can also use for the properties top, left, right and bottom. So what we are now going for is a banner, a commercial banner. So usually it's on the right side, however let me do it on the left side, as there is already other stuff right here. And that banner I will now give a height of 100 pixels and a width of 100 pixels and a height of 400 pixels. And this is where that banner shall be located. So this one shall not be fixed. When we scroll the page, this one shall not scroll along. So fixed, this is why we only would use fixed for. So fixed is out of the question. This one we are not using. So we are using absolute, because relative is only used to provide a relativity point for an absolutely positioned element. So this one I will now take out, make absolute. Let me first of all do it. And this code that the banner element I have already created, I have included it inside the navigation. Because I would argue, or it's most likely that the navigation would be the one that we want that banner to be relative to. Not to the viewport, of course, but to the navigation. Because it starts out right here. So therefore the navigation, let me go to the banner container. The navigation I will give position relative, so that the banner, which is a child of the navigation, will be relative to the navigation and not to the viewport. So position relative right here. And the banner itself I would now take also out of the flow, I would give the position of absolute. Position of absolute. And this one shall be a way, first of all let me give it a width and a height. Width of 100 pixels and a height of 400 pixels. And here we go, here it is. And now we can move it away, of course, by using left, right, bottom, top, wherever we ultimately want it. And the value that we are dealing with now here is left. And if we are using left 100 pixel, for example, it would even move further this direction. But we want it to go left this direction, so we are just going for negative. So I am now making use of left with a negative value, 100 pixels. And this is now where that banner is displayed, where it ultimately shall be. So this is our last specific examples in regards to absolute and relative. Fixed examples we have already seen. Let's go for an hybrid option, where we are dealing with both. Or where we at least can deal with both. We have actually multiple options here. So what we are going for is a layout. And this layout, for example, on the left, this left column is fixed to the viewport. It's always there wherever we are scrolling the page. The only reason why we would use fixed for. Now here are two other columns, this one and this aside column here. And both of them are not fixed. When we are scrolling the page, they are not moving along. And here once again, let me pull out this recommendation. I would very much suggest to us that whenever we are dealing with things, with elements that belong together, we would create immediately a container box for those elements. So what I would do in this case here is, even though we could keep things separate, so one container box for this one as it is fixed to the viewport, then one container box for both of these columns, as we then have control because both of them are not fixed. Then we have control of both of these columns at the same time. We could go for this column and then put another one next to it, but it's much easier to go for both of them straight away as they belong together. Both of them are not fixed. They are both in the flow or can be in the flow. They belong together. And then in here we would go for two separate columns next to each other ultimately. So always, as we have seen already, right? For example, if I go back to week number 5, here there is a section on children's stories, a section on scientific papers. Each section gets its own container box. Then, for example, inside children's stories, there is one story, then maybe comes another one. Each story itself would get a container box. Always when we are dealing with something that belongs together, straight away shall have its own container box so that we have control of each area completely without having to set multiple things in order to get that control. Always strongly recommending that always to follow this option. So let's go for this layout, and therefore I have a link here which is getting us to a sub page right here, and on that sub page what I have created here are just two container boxes. The first container box shall be that fixed column on the left, and the second container box is that one that has two other columns inside it that are not fixed to the viewport. That first one I have inserted a little bit of text already, and all I have given this one is a border so that we can identify it. Nothing else so far. So it's still display block right now. It's in the flow, position static. And therefore the first thing that I'm doing now, I'm taking it out of the flow. I'm making it fixed to the viewport. And how high shall it be? It shall be as high as the viewport. So let me make use of top 0 and bottom 0. What we could also do here, we could shorten it, of course, because that box is most likely only going until here. So we could go bottom, whatever height that one is then ultimately. So bottom 100 pixel, for example. Let me now bring it the entire viewport. Let me make it the entire viewport, and let me give it a width of 300 pixels. And this is it. Now our fixed column has been created right here. This is our fixed column. And now comes our next box that shall take the entire area up here, which includes the other two columns. And that one I have given an ID static right column container. And this one, first of all, that one, we can take it out of the flow or not. We have two options here, at least two options that I can pull out here that come to my head straight away. So width, first of all, is 100%. Then, or we can set it to 100%. Let me give it a background now. Let me give it a background of red, for example, and let me give it a height, a very much height, so it still has a scroll bar ultimately attached to it. So let's take a look what happens. 100%. What does 100% refer to in this case? It's still an inflow element, and inflow is always relative when we are using percentages to the parent. So in this case to the body. And the body is the entire area going from all the way top and from all the way right to the left, all the way top to all the way to the bottom, including whatever is down in the scroll bar, all the way. And 100%, this would mean it would start right here on the left and end right here on the right. And because this column, the left column here, is out of the flow, it will not provide, this one doesn't take up space anymore. So the red one is right now underneath. It's starting here, ending here. So what we need to do with that column, we need to move it away from the left, 300 pixel, the width of our fixed column here. And we can do so, for example, by using margin left. Margin left of 300 pixel, which is exactly the width of that fixed container box that we have given 300 pixels to. And here it will be 300 pixels away from the left, which is now fine. However, it will still take up 100%, which is from here to here. It has only been moved away from the left 300 pixel. So therefore, what we have achieved now, what we have gotten here from the browser is a scroll bar horizontally as the content further goes horizontally into that direction. So what we need to do now is, of course, we want that red box, of course, to end right here and not to go further this direction. So therefore, one option that we have is to give it a calculation value once again. Hey, only the width shall only be calculated, please, for us, shall only be 100%, but then negative 300 pixels. Ultimately meaning that there is no overflow of 300 pixels here. Instead, it will end right here. So that is our first option that we have. Another option that we have, first of all, let me insert a little bit of text here so we can see the actual effect once again. So that this column is fixed to the viewport, this text, this column is not. And here we are scrolling along, everything is fine. And in here we would create now the other two boxes, the other two columns for our layout. Now another option that we have here is, instead of going for a calculation value here, what we can also do, we can take it out of the flow. So let me take it out of the flow by using position absolute, and then what we can do is move it away from the left by using the value left 300 pixels. And at the same time, at the right side, it shall also be at 0, meaning it will start right here and end right here. So that is another option that we have without going for the margin left in this case. Another thing would still be exactly the same effect. Now absolute that we have used here is still relative to the viewport. But this is the case right now as we are dealing with a full page right now. So in this case, keeping it to relative to the viewport is absolutely fine. Now one last comment here, what we could also do, for example, besides this layout here, we could also create something like this, which is exactly the same, just a little bit of gap in here. So for example, this one shall be away from the left as well. Let me move it away from the left of 100 pixel, for example. Now this one shall be away now 500 pixel, which ultimately gives us a gap on the left here, and on the right still, left one of course still fixed, that one is not fixed. Another idea for us to what layout we can achieve by using this one. Now full page layouts, here we would of course now, at least it's not essential to use the value fixed, for example, as fixed is really only used when we are dealing with scroll bars. As they are then fixed to the viewport, they will follow us wherever we are scrolling. Relative, once again, is, at least from the examples that I know, is we only use it when we are making an absolute position element to be relative to some other element instead of to the viewport. And here for full page layouts, which we are still discussing in more detail in a coming week, those ones would not make use of fixed. So all that's on top here is we could make use of fixed as the entire area is already the viewport. So here it doesn't actually matter whether we make use of absolute or fixed. So same situation that we have just encountered for our layout. Whether we make that one absolute or fixed doesn't matter, as we are dealing already with the entire area here. So that's it for this week, and next week we are going into all about lists, and under that topic is also our drop-down menus. We will go over all the different drop-down menus, or quite a number of them. Drop-down menus, of course, they are out of the flow, they are on top of other stuff, and we take a look at sub-menus, sub-menus, and different stylistic things in regards to those menus. So it's all about lists next week, and of course it will give us a good review of this week once again, as these drop-down menus are always usually out of the flow.